All right, good afternoon, everybody, as we're here for the second series preview that I'll be taking a look at. Of course, this morning did a live stream and looked at the Raptors and the Wizards, which I think will be a really exciting series, especially for the standards that we've seen for 1-8 series matchups in the past. I've discussed, the battle of the backcourts and kind of the matchups that are to be expected in that series, which should be really entertaining to watch. But now we're going to take a look at the 1-8 matchup in the Western Conference. The 65-17 Houston Rockets, who finished with the league's best record throughout the year. Mike D'Antoni's team, of course, just having an absolutely ridiculous offense for the entire year, setting records for three-point shooting. This is a team that made 1,256 threes as a team. They by far led the league in threes taken and made. At the same time, by far last in the league in two-pointers attempted and made. So taking a look at basically what makes the Rockets, well, it's not just that they're a great offensive team, which they have been in years past. They have been a top 5 offensive team, throughout the past couple of years. But not only do they have the second highest points per game in the NBA, you're also looking at 103.9 opponents' points per game, which is 7th, a defensive rating of 106.1, which is 6th. So right then and there, you're looking at a team that doesn't just have the strength on offense. They have the highest offensive rating in the NBA on the other hand. So like I was talking about the Toronto Raptors, like immediately on paper, the first thing you see is that they kind of have a championship formula in place, barring injury. And now there are some injury updates. They don't know if Ryan Anderson is going to be ready for game 1. He has missed several parts of the season. Clint Capella, who's dealing with a hand injury, he does not know if he's going to be available for game 1. And Eric Gordon, with some ankle soreness, he is questionable for game 1 against the Timberwolves as well. And Luke Ba-Mute, who's a really good piece off the bench, had a dislocated right shoulder, and he is supposed to miss up to 4 weeks of action. So that would probably take you through at least a round and a half. So looking at that, the Rockets do have some injury issues that they're going to have to confront, that they have to deal with. But at the same time, they have the league's likely MVP in James Harden, Chris Paul, one of the best point guards of all time, if you're strictly looking at regular season numbers, and a wide array of three-point shooters that somehow always get their way open. Now, I would expect Clint Capella to play because his primary role on this team is simply to set pick and rolls and make this dynamic offense possible. And then when you have guys like Trevor Ariza and Ryan Anderson and Eric Gordon and PJ Tucker and Gerald Green and Joe Johnson, the list goes on and on. You have so many options, and even if a few of them are having bad nights, one of them is going to have a good night. And James Harden and Chris Paul have a good or great night essentially every night. So that is what makes the Rockets really tough to beat, on top of the fact that that defensively, they really have turned it up in the second part of the season in a lot of ways. I think such a big part of that is PJ Tucker. And I think once he was inserted into the starting lineup, you really saw how good this team can really be. I mean, PJ Tucker only started 34 games this year, but he really anchors the defense for this team. He really makes a lot of what they do possible on that end of the floor. And that is, of course, so overlooked. And I think obviously, Chris Paul's a great defensive point guard, and Trevor Ariza is an outstanding defender. But I think that James Harden even catches more criticism than he deserves for his defensive play. I really don't believe he's an awful defender by any means, and especially on this team this year, even if he is one of the I guess, worst defenders on the team, it is still in a situation to where you have a lot of other better defenders around you that not only make things possible when the ball's in your hand, but on the other end of the floor can help compensate for what perhaps wasn't compensated for in years past. So, I mean, I really think that this is a complete roster, and I love the additions of Gerald Green and Joe Johnson. I was wondering why Gerald Green had not gotten a deal in the NBA for the first part of this year. The Rockets give him a call. He's also a Houston native, so that was certainly special for him to come back. And Gerald Green's always just a really fun player to watch. He's incredibly athletic, and he's a great shooter. Now, certainly very streaky, but that's the kind of thing, is that he can have a game where he'll hit 8-9 threes for you, and that can very well happen, once or twice in a series. So having a guy like that on your team that's going to be out on the floor, being very aggressive, very athletic, and looking to take shots whenever whenever the opportunity presents itself. That's something that just fits so well with the Rockets' identity. And I feel like maybe he wouldn't have been able to get his way back into the NBA if he didn't find a fit like he has on this Rockets team. And then you look at Joe Johnson, having somebody that just as recently as last year, multiple times in that series against the LA Clippers, took over a game in the fourth quarter, showing that ISO Joe still is indeed one of the most dominant offensive players in clutch time. And that's a weapon that they have. That's somebody that they can go to. And I know that Joe Johnson's never won a ring, but I mean, we've seen it throughout his whole career. He's in the 16th season, and he's always been able to make big shots, to be on the floor, to make big plays. And that addition as well, I think, just made this Rockets team just a whole nother layer of great, just another thing that you have to address when their second unit is on the floor. So, I mean, this is a really, really fun team to watch. And the matchup that they have, I mean, they're facing a team that is also extremely fun to watch. But just looking at the offensive numbers, I mean, James Harden averaging 30.4, 5.4, 8.8. Chris Paul averaging 18.6, 5.4, 7.9. Clint Capella averaging 13.9, 10.8. Eric Gordon averaging 18, primarily off the bench. Gerald Green averaging 12.1. And Trevor Ariza averaging 11.7. And while the three-point shooting, there's nobody on the team that shot 40%. Ryan Anderson shot 38.6. That was the highest. Everybody shot in the mid to high 30s. Like James Harden shot 36.7%. But when you chalk up 10 a game, that's going to make a difference. And that just kind of shows how much the Rockets have changed the game in that regard, as far as really revolutionizing the three-point shot and its importance and its relevancy in basketball. And I think, of course, along with Stephen Curry and the Golden State Warriors, that has been a huge part of the NBA in the last 5 to 6 years, because you could even go back, to 2011, 2012, and it's just absolutely nothing like the game is today. But on the other hand, there is, of course, the Minnesota Timberwolves, who were in position to get home court in the first round for the majority of the season, but they're finally healthy. Dealt with a very costly injury to Jimmy Butler right before the All-Star break. And I mean, this is a really interesting team, one that started off a lot better than how they finished, but they still worked their way to a 47-35 record. And that game last night between Minnesota and Denver, really incredible, ended up going to overtime. Minnesota was able to grind out a win after Denver came back and actually briefly took the lead at the end of that game. And I don't think there's too much to be upset about if you're the Denver Nuggets. A really great effort in that final game. But Minnesota Timberwolves get their first playoff appearance since 2004. And this is a team that everybody knows what they're capable of offensively. They're 8th in points per game and 4th in offensive rating, but that's while being 17th in opponents' points per game and 27th in defensive rating. Now, their defensive rating had gotten a lot better in the middle point of the season when Jimmy Butler really started to take the role of being the guy on the team until his injury. And then that was, once again, their first option became Karl-Anthony Towns. And a lot of the problems that they've had with their defense is because Andrew Wiggins, who, while he has improved marginally, albeit, he is still one of the worst defenders in basketball. When you have him on the floor for as much as he is on the floor, that's what makes Jimmy Butler so big and kind of neutralizing that defensive weakness that Andrew Wiggins had. So, I mean, this is a good team. Like, the Timberwolves certainly have much more talent than a typical 8 seed does, especially looking at a legitimate big three of Andrew Wiggins, Karl-Anthony Towns, and Jimmy Butler. And that's without mentioning Jeff Teague, who I believe to be one of the most underrated players in the NBA, somebody that really flew under the limelight in Atlanta for so many years and had a lot of really outstanding seasons, was a point guard, for a 60-win team. And, last year, very quietly, had a great year in Indiana, and this year, and he was injured for part of the year as well. And that certainly had an impact on Minnesota. But, he's certainly somebody that is very consistent, is an outstanding passer, and is a capable shooter as well. So, I mean, if you want to throw him into there as well, you have kind of a big four in your starting lineup in Minnesota. There is a lot of talent there. There's a lot of ability, and they've beaten a lot of really good teams this year. And their bench isn't awful. You got Tyus Jones, somebody that's in the second year in the league, a Minnesota native, Gorgie Jang, Nemanja Bjelica, who have both had really big years for the Timberwolves. And then the recent addition of Derrick Rose, who had a game the other night. I believe it was against Memphis, and he looked vintage. D Rose looked excellent. So whatever you can get out of him in the playoffs is certainly extra. But this is a really talented team. It's just that Jimmy Butler still isn't quite 100%. I think throughout the series, if he begins to gain a better hold of his ability to be able to play longer, because since he hasn't really been playing full minutes in the recent games, that would really improve the Timberwolves' chances of making this a series. And I think if you look furthermore, I mean, the Timberwolves just don't really like shooting threes, and that's what makes this matchup very tough for them. They're 30th in the league in three-pointers taken and three-pointers made. Now, they do have some good shooters on their team, notably Karl-Anthony Towns, who shoots 42% on the season, and Nemanja Bjelica, who shoots 41.5%. But the Timberwolves, in order to have a chance, are going to need to try and counter the three. So I think having Jimmy Butler back is going to help with that because he's a very capable three-point shooter. But I think you're going to need to see Andrew Wiggins start to make some of these shots. Like, he's going to need to have some big games if the Timberwolves are going to have any chance of making this a very competitive series. I think what you're going to get out of Karl-Anthony Towns. I think Jeff Teague is going to have a big game in this series. I think Jamal Crawford, who has actually historically really struggled in the playoffs, I think off the bench, he's going to come in and have a big game or two. Those pieces are in place for this team. There's a lot of talent there. There's a lot of upside, but I just feel with like the way the season ended, they know they should be in a much better position than where they are now. But at the same time, they're in the playoffs. They get their chance against the Houston Rockets. And just looking down the line at the individual matchups and just trying to identify the talent differential, kind of like what I was doing with my earlier video, point guard, when you're comparing Jeff Teague to Chris Paul, you know where the edge is. And I do think that, matching up like Jimmy Butler and James Harden, that's a very exciting matchup, especially because of how good of a defender Jimmy Butler is. So for that reason, I think there's going to be more of an emphasis on the array of three-point shooters that the Rockets have, along with Chris Paul, considering that he easily is able to outmatch Jeff Teague. But I really do anticipate strong defense from Jimmy Butler in this series. And then furthermore, you're looking at matching up a guy like Andrew Wiggins with PJ Tucker or Ryan Anderson or one of the forwards. And then at the center spot, you have two of the best in the business for different reasons at Karl-Anthony Towns and Clint Capella. So no, the talent differential isn't big, but I just think with how things have been going, and while the Rockets haven't even played great ball, they're also resting up. They will be ready for this series. And I wouldn't be surprised if it's a competitive series, but I just don't think that Minnesota is in rhythm enough to really be able to compete with a team that is not only this good, but is this good in the opposite ways that the Timberwolves are. And considering that the Timberwolves are going to really need to make three-pointers to make this a series, even with how good they are offensively, even with how good they are getting to the line, something that having Jimmy Butler in your lineup greatly improves with. I just don't really see the Houston Rockets really struggling for a long time against this team. I think the Minnesota Timberwolves are in an outstanding position for the future. I think they have a great coach. I really like Tom Thibodeau. I think he needs to learn how to manage the bench better. But outside of that, I mean, this is somebody that's incredibly experienced. Won a ring as an assistant coach with the Celtics back in 2008. And is somebody that is certainly capable of really getting this group of guys and getting them to mature together and move forward and, really make a difference and make some deep playoff runs as time goes on. But I don't think that the time for a deep playoff run is in 2018. I'm feeling Rockets in 5 in this one. I just think they have too much. They're a historically great offensive team, and I just can't really see a newly healthy Minnesota Timberwolves team that needs to get back in rhythm really the Celtics and the Bucks, the 2-7 matchup in the Eastern Conference. Thank you for tuning in. That's all we have.